It's strange how political power shifts. One moment, the system feels immovable, layers of tradition, endless debates, and rules designed to slow everything down. Then suddenly one unexpected move upends the whole game board. That's what's happening right now in Washington. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has proposed what he describes as a path to end the government shutdown. Behind the scenes, former President Donald Trump appears to be preparing one of his boldest political maneuvers yet, one that could reshape how Congress functions for years to come. Because this isn't just about reopening federal offices. It's about control, legacy, and whether the old rules of American politics still make sense in a time of growing dysfunction. Picture this, the government shutdown has stretched into its 6th week. Federal workers have missed multiple paychecks. Families that rely on those incomes are struggling to cover rent and groceries. At airports across the country, lines grow longer every day as security officers and air traffic controllers call out because they can't afford gas to drive to work. Travelers are exhausted, frustrated, angry. One woman interviewed at an airport said she wished senators could be stranded alongside them. Maybe then they'd understand. Another visitor from overseas worried that she might not be able to get home at all. The tension is no longer political theater. It's personal. Shutdowns work like pressure cookers, heat builds, and there's nowhere for it to escape. The longer it continues, the more intense it becomes. That's exactly the environment now shaping Washington. Both parties are holding firm, waiting for the other side to blink first. But while the public sees chaos, the reality is that both sides are playing calculated moves, and one may be thinking several steps ahead. Schumer's recent proposal was pitched as simple and reasonable. On the Senate floor, he said Democrats were ready to reopen the government immediately if Republicans agreed to extend health care subsidies under the Affordable Care Act for 1 more year. After that, he said both parties could sit down and negotiate broader reforms to control medical costs. On its surface, it sounded like compromise. But the subtext was strategic. By framing the proposal as a good faith gesture, Schumer effectively set a trap. If Republicans accepted, Democrats could claim a policy win without major concessions. If they refused, Democrats could accuse them of ignoring Americans in need. It was in the language of bipartisanship. Meanwhile, Trump and his allies were treating the same standoff as something larger than a routine funding fight. They saw it as an opportunity to question the foundation of how Congress governs. For decades, Washington has operated under the assumption that gridlock is normal, that slow progress is a sign of responsibility, not failure. The filibuster, the procedural holds, the endless committee debates, all are justified as necessary checks and balances. But Trump's circle began asking a different question. What if the system isn't protecting democracy, but paralyzing it? What if the delays, compromises, and backroom negotiations are the very reason nothing ever changes? That line of thinking leads directly to one of the most controversial ideas in modern American politics, ending the Senate filibuster. For those unfamiliar, the filibuster is a rule requiring most legislation to reach a 60-vote threshold before moving forward. It's meant to encourage cooperation and prevent one party from dominating the other. In practice, it often means that little gets done because securing 60 votes in a deeply divided Senate is nearly impossible. As a result, major bills stall, negotiations drag, and the public grows increasingly cynical. Trump's advisors are reportedly considering whether that rule should go, at least temporarily. Their argument is straightforward. If voters gave a party a majority, the majority should have the power to act. Why keep procedural barriers that serve mainly to preserve gridlock? The logic appeals to those tired of endless political stalemates, but it also terrifies opponents who warn that once such a barrier is removed, future leaders could push through sweeping changes with minimal debate. The question becomes less about party loyalty and more about trust. Do Americans trust any political faction with that much unchecked authority? While that debate unfolds, the Democratic Party faces its own internal struggles. Recent state-level victories in solidly blue areas have been celebrated publicly, but privately, party strategists know the margins were thinner than expected. Winning where you're already favored isn't a sign of momentum. It's a sign of survival. Polls also reveal a leadership vacuum. When voters are asked who leads the Democratic Party, the most common answer isn't a name at all. Sure, there's no single figure uniting the message or driving a strategy. For Republicans, Trump remains a clear focal point. That clarity, love it or hate it, gives him speed and cohesion. For Democrats, fragmentation means slower responses and mixed messaging. Those weaknesses are becoming visible in the places meant to showcase progressive policy and action. Take Chicago, long considered a testing ground for democratic governance. The city now finds itself grappling with mounting challenges: crime, budget strain, and a migration crisis. Recently, local protests outside a federal detention center resulted in arrests and confrontation between demonstrators and officers. The situation highlighted a deeper tension between city leadership and federal enforcement, with courts now imposing extra restrictions on agents working there. Critics argue that the city's leadership has prioritized symbolism over stability, allowing local unrest to overshadow practical governance. Supporters say it's about protecting civil rights. Either way, underscores a broader perception in the national Democrats are struggling to balance ideals with outcomes. At the core of this shutdown, however, lies one issue that affects nearly every American household: healthcare. The immediate dispute centers on subsidies created under the Affordable Care Act. These payments, designed to keep premiums affordable, are in reality government transfers to insurance companies meant to stabilize the market. As supporters argue, they prevent chaos in the healthcare system. Critics see them as corporate welfare, taxpayer money propping up a broken model. Extending those subsidies for another year would cost roughly $35 billion, and yet there's little evidence it would make care more affordable for ordinary families. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana described the dilemma bluntly, saying it's like handing insurers billions and trusting them to lower prices out of goodwill. For many Americans, that frustration hits home. They've watched premiums and deductibles rise even as politicians promise relief. They've seen their tax dollars spent on programs that rarely seem to help them directly. So when Schumer calls his proposal an effort to make health care more affordable, skeptics hear something else and serve the status quo long enough to get through another election cycle. And that's where public opinion begins to shift. Over the past several weeks, more people have started examining how these policies actually work. Not policy experts, just regular citizens trying to make sense of their bills and benefits. Many are discovering that the system marketed as a safety net often functions more as a subsidy engine for corporations. Once people recognize that pattern, it's difficult to ignore. The frustration is turning into a quiet awakening, one that cuts across partisan lines. Trump's team seems to understand this undercurrent of discontent, and they know voters are exhausted by procedural gridlock and political grandstanding. The shutdown has become a case study a visible symbol of how paralyzed the federal government has become. And that's why the idea of changing the rules, even radically, is gaining traction. If Congress can't even pass a temporary funding bill without descending into crisis, maybe they argue the process itself is the problem. That argument appeals to a specific kind of American impatience, a desire to see government function with the same efficiency people expect from the private sector. It's a perspective shaped by decades of frustration where compromise feels indistinguishable from failure, but bold reforms come with risk. Imagine a car engine that's misfiring. You can either keep driving carefully and hope it holds together, or you can pull over, take it apart, and rebuild it completely. The first choice preserves stability. The second might get you farther, or it might leave you stranded. Ending the filibuster and overhauling Senate procedure is that kind of gamble. If executed carefully, it could revive a sense of productivity in Washington. If mishandled, it could destabilize the balance of power that's defined American democracy for generations. For Trump's allies, the shutdown is not an obstacle, but leverage. The proof point they need to justify change. Their argument goes like this. Both parties are under pressure. Democrats want the government reopened to ease public frustration. Republicans want to move forward with their agenda. Trump's position is that reopening under the same dysfunctional framework only ensures another shutdown later. Instead, use this crisis as the moment Washington works. It's a classic disruptor strategy, turning dysfunction into momentum for reform. And business leaders often seize moments of instability to push through structural change. It's easier to convince people to accept drastic adjustments when the old system is visibly failing. That's what's happening now. The longer the shutdown continues, the more the public questions why these deadlocks keep happening at all. And once that question takes hold, it's difficult to contain. Trump's team appears to be leaning into that frustration, not just to win a negotiation, but to reshape expectations for how fast government should move. If the filibuster were to end, even temporarily, so the pace of legislation could accelerate dramatically. Major bills on immigration, taxation, or infrastructure could pass within weeks instead of months. Supporters of the idea say that's exactly what voters want, action instead of excuses. But the same speed that makes rapid progress possible also increases the risk of serious mistakes. Laws could pass without sufficient debate or scrutiny. Power could shift so quickly that the country begins swinging one to the other with each election cycle. The very friction that frustrates Americans today might be what prevents deeper instability tomorrow. In engineering, friction is not just resistance, it's control. Remove too much, and the system spins out of balance. The same applies to politics. Debate, delay, and procedural rules may be inconvenient, but they also prevent any single group from reshaping the nation overnight. They force negotiation and, at least in theory, moderation. The question facing Washington is whether that slow-moving process still serves the public in an age of instant communication and crisis-driven politics. The larger issue isn't Trump or Schumer as individuals. It's about the structure of American governance itself. Are the current rules, the filibuster, the procedural holds, the budget brinkmanship, protecting democracy or stifling it? Is gridlock a symptom of broken system? Or the inevitable cost of checks and balances? And those questions don't have easy answers. Ending the filibuster might fix short-term paralysis, but it could also erode one of the few remaining mechanisms that force cooperation across party lines. This moment represents a genuine crossroads, and on one path lies continuity a system that moves slowly but preserves institutional stability. On the other lies transformation, a faster. Traditionalists argue that the system, however frustrating, has safeguarded democracy for more than 2 centuries. Reformers counter that the system has calcified, that bureaucracy and procedural obstacles now serve as excuses for inaction rather than tools for fairness. Both views contain truth. Congress's approval ratings remain historically low. Public trust in government continues to erode. Many Americans believe that neither party truly represents their concerns anymore. In that environment, calls for reform, even radical reform, begin to sound less extreme and more like necessity. Yet history offers a warning. Democracies rarely collapse through sudden. They erode gradually as norms are abandoned one by one, often in the name of efficiency or progress. So the real challenge is balance. How do you modernize a system without dismantling its safeguards? How do you make government faster without making it reckless? The decisions being weighed in Washington right now about the structure of congressional negotiations, about the limits of executive power, will shape not only the current presidency, but the expectations of every administration that follows. Ultimately, this is less about politics than about civic responsibility. If Americans want a government that works, they must decide what working actually means. Does it mean compromise and deliberation, even when it feels slow, or decisive action, even when it risks overreach? Each path carries consequences. Each demands trust, not just in leaders, but in the resilience of the system itself. What's clear is that the status quo isn't satisfying anyone. Federal workers shouldn't have to line up at food banks to make a political point. Travelers shouldn't be stranded because lawmakers can't agree on a budget. Local government shouldn't be paralyzed by competing directives from state and federal agencies. And citizens shouldn't have to become policy analysts just to understand where their tax dollars go. This shutdown, like others before it, is more than a budgeting dispute. It's a mirror reflecting the deeper dysfunction of modern governance. Whether the solution is reform, restraint, or something in between, this moment demands honest reflection about what kind of democracy Americans want to preserve. Because once the nation becomes accustomed to dysfunction, once gridlock starts to feel normal, reversing that trend becomes far harder. So maybe the real question isn't whether to protect the system or rebuild it, but whether the country still believes in its ability to govern itself at all. That's the debate now playing out in Washington, and the answer will define America's political identity for the next decade and beyond.